Then you go on to say something which is, I believe, is a slight, and I believe it's an attempt to try and score points against Islam. It's very clear that it is, but it's also weak as an argument. Let's see what you have to say about Islam or Muslim countries and the state of economic affairs in Muslim countries.
You know, the states dominated by Islam are not economically productive. And that's quite an interesting mystery.
So this point that Jordan Peterson makes here, he says states that are occupied by Islam are not economically productive. First of all, how do you define occupied by Islam? And secondly, how do you define economically productive? What are the measures that you're using? GDP per capita, for example, where 4 Muslim majority countries are in the top 10. Which ones are you talking about? Are you talking about GDP or what exactly? And I must say, this is a methodologically flawed approach in the first instance. Analyzing an ideology and economic productivity of a country. Why? Because why today? First of all, why today? Why not look 400 years ago in the Ottoman Empire or Islamic Spain or the Abbasids or the Umayyun or the Khilafah Rashidiyah, when economic productivity was very high and Islam was being implemented at a much more strict level, if you like? Is it because it fits a particular narrative which may indicate that Islam as a religion inhibits economic productivity, similar to the kind of narrative we dealt with in the previous episode? This is a weak argument. I'm really sorry, it's a weak argument. And with all due respect, you weren't even brave enough to make the argument properly because you said it's an interesting mystery. And you shroud your sentences with words of ambiguity and uncertainty when, with all due respect, sometimes you don't want to make the argument directly because you know it's susceptible to a high-level refutation, like the one you're seeing right now. Because the question is, if it's to do with ideology, my question to you is, in the mid-18th century, 1760, when the Industrial Revolution started, in Britain, for example, what was the state of affairs relating to ideology? Is it the same? Are the morals and ethics of Britain in the 18th century similar or distinctly different from the morals and ethics that we're seeing today in the 21st century? I would wager, especially on women's rights, that it's completely different. And in fact, that was a time where economic productivity in Britain was very, very high comparative to the other states. In fact, you could say the highest. You can make this argument. And so if it was to do with ideology, then once again, you'd expect the morals and the ethics and the ideological standpoints to have an impact in the inhibitive or negative effect of that economy. Likewise, you can say the same thing about the slave trade. Well, America was doing very well when it had black slaves. It was doing very well when it was trading them and when it was forcing them to pick cotton and so on, before the American Civil War in the mid-19th century, where the morals and the ethics and the ideological standpoints, especially of, let's say, southern states in America, were they the same or distinctly different from the way they are now? I think you would say the latter. So much so that I had a constitutional effect with the 13th Amendment and other such things that happened in the cultural atmosphere in America. Ideological differences. Yet despite the ideological differences, which one can notice in the mid-19th century, say, and now, say, in American culture, we still see that America was doing very well economically at a time where its ideology was different to the way it is now. So if ideology or liberal, or the liberal ideology of today, let's say Western ideology of today, the cultural and moral and ethical standpoints of the West today were shaping forces for how the economy behaves, then why do we see that it behaves in sometimes even a comparatively stronger way in the past where ethics were different in America and in the West generally to the way it is now? So you see, this is a methodologically flawed thing because we're seeing transient ethics here. And this is really basic for a social scientist, that correlation does not always mean causation. And if it was to do with ethics and morals and ideology, then why are we seeing the rise of Japan Japan is not a Western country, and it has ethics and cultures distinct from the West, and yet we're seeing its economy rise at a staggering rate. Technological and scientific and economic developments there. Moreover, if you wanted to play this game, we can go further. And we can say to you that in fact, I'm not going to say most, but many of the countries which have, let's say, Western Enlightenment ideas in sub-Saharan Africa and in Southern America are below the poverty line, and in fact do worse than, even on a GDP level, okay, Muslim majority countries. So if what we are saying is, if we put Western Enlightenment ideas into countries, we expect the economic development to be better, then why are we not seeing that in countries in South America and Sub-Saharan Africa, where they're indebted, where they're impoverished, and so on? So you see, it's a failed attempt at a slight at the Islamic civilization and a weak argument that we expected better from Dr. Jordan Peterson. And it's these kinds of arguments, with all due respect, which go back to our theme. The theme is you're trying to whitewash the Muslim contribution. You're trying to minimize the Islamic contribution. And somehow, and you could say with this kind of Lexis here, it's clear that you're trying to connect failure with Islam somehow, whether it's economic failure, scientific failure, or lack of productivity, or whatever it may be, with Islam. And it's failed. The arguments have failed. And maybe this is the reason why you didn't want to have a discussion with me, because you knew these things are on the record and you knew you'd be accounted for it. But I think it's high time, Jordan Peterson, if we want to have an authentic discussion, we have to start with retractions. Because these kinds of things are not just imprecise, as we've shown. Sorry, they're imprecise. They're ahistorical, they're inaccurate, but they're weak as arguments. And unless one revises and retracts, or otherwise suspends judgments on issues to do with these kinds of points that you've mentioned here, then how are we going to have a proper dialogue between about Islam and the West, for example, and the interaction between these two things, if we can separate them at all? And hopefully that edified some of Jordan Peterson's followers, and inshallah even Jordan Peterson himself. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.